Disappearing object phenomenon. You are looking for your keys. You remember setting them down. Not a vague feeling, not a guess. You can picture the exact moment, the sound they made when they touched the table, the spot near the edge, just beside your phone. You even remember thinking, I will put them here so I do not forget. And yet now they are gone. You check your pockets, even though you know you already did. You retrace your steps, slower this time, as if moving carefully might somehow rewind the last few minutes. Nothing. Then later, maybe hours later, maybe the next day, the keys are suddenly there, sitting in plain view, exactly where you remember leaving them. You laugh it off. You tell yourself you were tired, distracted. Human memory is flawed after all. But for just a moment, before the laughter kicks in, there is that quiet, unsettling thought. I know they were not there before. Most people have experienced something like this, an object that vanishes and reappears, a phone that seems to slip out of reality for a while, glasses that are found in the only place you already checked 3 times, a remote control that returns without explanation, and the almost universal reaction is dismissal. Stress does strange things to the mind. The brain fills in gaps. We misremember. We are busy. We are not paying attention. And that reaction makes sense. It is reasonable. It keeps life moving. If we stopped every time reality felt slightly off, we would never get anything done. But here is the strange part. These experiences are not rare. They happen across cultures, ages, professions, and lifestyles. People who are calm, well-rested, and mentally healthy report the same thing, and often what bothers them is not that the object disappeared. It is the certainty they felt that it should have been there. This is where the idea, often called the disappearing object phenomenon, enters the conversation. It is not a formal scientific diagnosis. It is a label people use to describe a very specific kind of experience. An everyday object seems to vanish from a normal environment, despite being deliberately placed somewhere. It is searched for thoroughly. Then, without a clear explanation, it returns. Sometimes in the original location, sometimes somewhere equally obvious. The experience feels different from simple forgetfulness. There is a strong sense that something about the sequence of events does not line up. People who experience it often describe a strange emotional shift. At first, mild annoyance, then confusion, then a creeping sense of unease, not fear exactly. More like a quiet disturbance, as if reality skipped a beat and hoped no one would notice. What makes this phenomenon so unsettling is how ordinary it is. There are no flashing lights, no dramatic moments, no witnesses pointing and shouting. It happens in kitchens, bedrooms, offices, and classrooms. During routines so familiar that we operate on autopilot. And maybe that is the point. When reality glitches do not announce themselves, they blend into daily life, hiding behind plausible explanations. The disappearing object phenomenon challenges a simple assumption we rely on constantly, that the physical world is stable and continuous, that objects remain where they are unless acted upon. That time moves forward in a clean, orderly way. When something violates that expectation, even briefly, it creates a crack in our sense of control. We depend on memory to anchor us to reality. When memory feels trustworthy, but reality disagrees, which one do you question? What makes it even more uncomfortable is that this phenomenon does not require extreme conditions. It does not need isolation, danger, or altered states. It happens while making coffee, getting dressed, doing homework, or packing a bag. It slips into moments when your mind is calm and your surroundings are familiar. That closeness makes it harder to distance yourself from it. You cannot just say that only strange people experience strange things. One well-known real-world account, often discussed, comes from cognitive psychology research on object permanence and attention. In controlled experiments, participants were asked to place objects in visible locations, perform a brief, unrelated task, and then retrieve them. In some cases, the objects were deliberately moved by researchers. Participants would sometimes insist the object had never been absent, even when shown recordings proving otherwise. But in a smaller number of cases, participants reported the opposite. They were convinced the object had been missing longer than it actually was, or that it reappeared in a way that felt impossible. These moments unsettled researchers because they revealed how perception, memory, and expectation can drift apart without warning. Outside the lab, there are historical anecdotes that feel even stranger. Some 19th-century household journals describe tools disappearing during work and returning after prayers or breaks, often interpreted at the time as spiritual or symbolic events. Modern readers might reinterpret these as cognitive errors, but the consistency of the descriptions is curious. The writers emphasize certainty. Not belief, certainty. What science can say with confidence is that the brain is not a passive recorder. It actively predicts the world. It fills gaps. It smooths transitions. Under certain conditions, attention narrows and memory becomes less reliable. That explains a lot, but not everything. Especially when multiple people search together, fail to find an object, and later witness its return, or when the object appears somewhere that would have been impossible to miss. And so the phenomenon sits in an uncomfortable middle ground, too ordinary to be dismissed as fantasy, too subtle to be proven as something more. It does not demand belief. It simply asks a question. If reality is as stable as we think, why do these moments leave such a lasting impression? Why do people remember them years later, even when they cannot remember what they had for breakfast last week? Why does the feeling linger that something quietly slipped through the cracks? Maybe the disappearing object phenomenon is just a mirror, showing us the limits of attention and memory. Or maybe it hints at something stranger, small mismatches between perception and reality, micro-fractures that close before we can examine them, tiny reminders that the world we move through effortlessly every day may be held together by more assumptions than we realize. The next time something vanishes and reappears, you will probably laugh. You will shake your head and move on. But maybe, just for a second, you will pause and wonder whether the object moved at all, or whether something else shifted instead. It is strange when you think about it, right? If this one stirred something in you, stay a little longer, because some of the most unsettling glitches are still ahead. And maybe, by the time this series ends, you will realize there was one experience we never mentioned at all. Not because it does not exist, but because it belonged only to you. As if the universe chose, just once, to let you notice something no one else did. Fata Morgana, floating cities. Have you ever been on a long drive, or maybe standing outside on a hot afternoon, staring towards the horizon, when something feels slightly off? At first it looks normal. Just sky, just distance, just the familiar outline of buildings or mountains far away. Then you blink, and suddenly it looks like the city ahead of you is floating. Not metaphorically, not in a poetic way. It looks as if the buildings have lifted themselves off the ground, hovering silently in the air. You laugh it off. Maybe you rub your eyes. Maybe you tell yourself it is just the heat. Just your vision playing tricks on you. And yet for a brief moment, you felt that quiet jolt in your chest. That subtle thought you rarely let yourself finish. What if what I am seeing is real, at least in some strange way? Most people react to moments like this by dismissing them almost instantly. We are very good at that. We blame fatigue, dehydration, stress, or the idea that our brains sometimes misfire like an old computer. We tell ourselves that our senses are unreliable and move on. That reaction makes sense. After all, if we questioned every strange perception, we would never feel grounded. But the interesting part is how common these moments actually are. People across the world report seeing distant ships hovering above the sea, cities suspended in the clouds, roads that appear to melt into the sky. And nearly everyone shrugs and says the same thing. It is just an illusion. Nothing worth thinking about too deeply. But what if that explanation is only part of the story? This brings us to one of the most unsettling reality glitches people have reported for centuries, something known as the Fata Morgana, often described as floating cities. The name sounds mythical, and in a way it is. But the experience itself is very real to the people who see it. A Fata Morgana is when distant objects like ships, coastlines, mountains, or entire cities appear stretched, stacked, distorted, or lifted into the air. Sometimes they look like towering castles. Sometimes they look like upside-down skylines. And sometimes they look so solid and detailed that people swear they could reach out and touch them. What makes this phenomenon so strange is not just how it looks, but how convincing it feels. People do not describe it as blurry or dreamlike. They describe it as a sharp, structured, and deeply unsettling. It looks wrong, but not in an obvious way. It looks like reality has quietly rearranged itself while no one was watching. Imagine walking along a beach and seeing what appears to be a massive city hovering above the water. The buildings are clear, the shapes make sense. Your brain recognizes them instantly. And yet you know that city should not be there. That conflict between what you see and what you know creates a deep discomfort. It forces a question most of us avoid. If my eyes can show me something this detailed and this wrong, how often is reality quietly misleading me in smaller ways? What makes Fata Morgana even more unsettling is that it does not require extreme conditions. You do not need to be in the Arctic or the middle of the ocean, though it often appears there. It can happen near highways, coastlines, deserts, or even large lakes. Anywhere layers of air with different temperatures settle on top of each other, reality can begin to bend in subtle ways. Your daily commute, your weekend trip, ordinary places where nothing mysterious is supposed to happen. One of the most famous historical accounts comes from sailors. For centuries, ships at sea reported seeing phantom land masses, towering cities, and unreachable coastlines. Some sailors changed course to chase them, only to find nothing there. Others believed they were seeing lost continents or supernatural realms. Entire myths were born from these sightings, not because people were foolish, but because what they saw looked undeniably real. These were not vague shapes. They were detailed visions that stayed long enough to be studied, sketched, and argued over. Even in more modern times, pilots have reported seeing cities floating above the horizon while flying over oceans or ice fields. Scientists explain that Fata Morgana occurs when light bends through layers of warm and cold air, stacking images on top of each other. And while that explanation is accurate, it does not fully remove the unease, because the deeper question remains. If reality can be rearranged so convincingly by something as invisible as air temperature, how much of what we trust is only stable by coincidence? There is something deeply unsettling about realizing that the world you see depends on conditions you rarely think about. Your vision feels direct, immediate, honest. And yet phenomena like this remind us that perception is more like an interpretation than a recording. Your brain is constantly guessing what the world should look like, filling in gaps, smoothing inconsistencies, and presenting you with a version of reality that feels solid enough to function in. That is where the idea of a reality glitch quietly creeps in, because a glitch is not a complete breakdown. It is a small error that reveals the system underneath. Fata Morgana does not shatter reality. It bends it just enough for you to notice the seams. And perhaps that is why floating cities feel so haunting. They do not scream danger. They do not announce themselves as impossible. They simply exist for a moment, calmly contradicting everything you thought you understood. They suggest that reality is not fixed, but conditional, dependent on perspective, environment, and the fragile cooperation between your senses and your brain. So the next time you see something strange on the horizon and laugh it off, maybe pause for a second longer. Ask yourself why your mind is so eager to dismiss it. Or ask yourself how often reality quietly reshapes itself without you noticing. And consider this: if entire cities can appear and vanish without leaving a trace, how many other parts of reality are only temporarily stable, waiting for the right conditions to reveal something unexpected? Maybe nothing supernatural is happening at all, or maybe reality is far more flexible than we like to admit. Either way, the next time the horizon looks wrong, you might find yourself wondering whether the glitch is in the world, or in the way we expect the world to behave. Doppelgangers. Have you ever had that small, almost silly moment where someone greets you with complete confidence, says your name clearly, smiles like they know you well, and you have absolutely no idea who they are. You laugh it off. Maybe you assume you forgot a face. Maybe you think they mistook you for someone else. But for a split second, there is that strange feeling, a flicker of discomfort, as if the world just slipped out of alignment and then snapped back into place. Most of the time, you shake it off and keep walking. But what if that moment was not a mistake at all? What if someone out there really does look exactly like you? And what if they are not just similar, but identical? Same face, same build, same expressions, maybe even the same voice. And what if, somewhere deep down, your mind noticed something it was not ready to understand? Most people respond to moments like this in a very practical way. They blame stress, poor memory, exhaustion, or coincidence. Our brains are busy, after all. We misremember things constantly. We mix up faces. We fill in gaps without realizing it. It feels reasonable to assume that the mind simply glitched for a second. And that reaction makes sense. It is comforting. It puts reality back into a neat and manageable box. But what is interesting is how often people report experiences that feel just a little too specific to dismiss so easily. Stories of being recognized by strangers in places they have never been. Stories of family members swearing they saw you earlier in the day, having a conversation you never had. Stories of locking eyes with someone who looks exactly like you, only for them to disappear into a crowd. These experiences are surprisingly common, and yet most people never pause to question what they might really mean. This brings us to one of the most unsettling reality glitches people have described for centuries: the doppelganger. The word itself comes from an old German term meaning double walker. At its simplest, a doppelganger is a person who looks exactly like someone else without being related to them. Not a twin, not a sibling. Just a perfect copy walking around in the world. People who encounter a doppelganger often describe an intense emotional reaction: confusion, fear, a deep sense that something is wrong. It is not just seeing a similar face, it is the feeling that reality duplicated something that should only exist once. That feeling is what makes the experience linger in the mind long after it happens. What makes doppelgangers so disturbing is how close they feel to normal life. You do not have to be in a haunted house or a strange laboratory to encounter one. People report seeing them at work, on public transport, in shops, even in their own homes. Sometimes it is you who sees your double. Sometimes it is other people who swear they saw you when you were somewhere else entirely. This challenges a very basic assumption we all carry without thinking about it: that there is only one you, one body moving through one timeline. When that assumption cracks, even slightly, it leaves behind a quiet sense of unease. There is also something deeply personal about the idea of a doppelganger. Unlike other mysteries, this one is about identity itself. Your face is how the world recognizes you. Your expressions are how you communicate without words. To imagine someone else wearing those same features is unsettling in a way that is hard to describe. It raises uncomfortable questions. Are we as unique as we think we are? Is identity tied to the body? Or is it something else entirely? And if someone else looks exactly like you, what truly separates you from them? One of the most famous real-world accounts comes from the early 19th century, involving a German writer named Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. He once described encountering his own double while riding on a road near his home. According to his account, he saw himself approaching from the opposite direction, wearing clothes he did not own at the time. Years later, he realized that he eventually did wear those exact clothes while riding on the same road. The experience deeply unsettled him, not because it was dramatic, but because it felt precise and personal. Even today, researchers debate whether this was a hallucination, a memory distortion, or something more difficult to categorize. What makes the story linger is that Goethe was known for being thoughtful and grounded, not prone to wild fantasies. Modern science does offer some possible explanations, but none feel fully satisfying. Neurologists have documented rare cases where damage to specific areas of the brain causes people to see doubles of themselves. These experiences can feel incredibly real, even when the person knows intellectually that something is wrong. Psychologists also point out that the human brain is exceptionally good at recognizing faces, sometimes too good. We see patterns even where none exist. And with billions of people in the world, it is statistically possible that someone out there looks very much like you. But statistics do not explain the timing, or the emotional intensity, or the moments when other people insist they interacted with you while you were somewhere else. What is especially fascinating is how often doppelganger stories appear during moments of stress, transition, or deep thought. People report them during long periods of exhaustion, grief, or major life changes. It is as if the mind, under pressure, becomes more sensitive to cracks in its own sense of reality, or perhaps more open to noticing things it normally filters out. This does not mean the experiences are imaginary. It simply means they happen at moments when we are less guarded, when the boundaries of our everyday awareness soften. The idea of doppelgangers has appeared in folklore across cultures for hundreds of years, often as an omen or warning. But what is striking is that even stripped of superstition, the core experience remains deeply unsettling. Seeing yourself from the outside, being replaced without noticing, realizing that your presence in the world might not be as singular as you assumed. These ideas tap into a quiet fear most people never consciously face. So the next time someone swears they saw you earlier, when you know you were not there, or the next time a stranger looks at you with recognition that feels misplaced, maybe pause for a moment before laughing it off. Maybe ask yourself why this experience feels so strange, even when logic tells you it should be harmless. Is it just a brain misfire, a coincidence? Or is it a reminder that our understanding of identity and reality is far thinner than we like to believe? If reality can produce near-perfect copies, whether through biology, perception, or something we do not yet understand, what does that say about the nature of the self? And if there really is someone out there who looks exactly like you, living a different life under the same face, would you even want to know? Or is it more comforting to believe that you are alone, unique, and untouched by the quiet glitches that might be hiding just beneath the surface of everyday life. The Mandela effect. Have you ever had one of those tiny moments where something feels off, but not enough to stop your day? Maybe you are reading a word you have seen your entire life, and suddenly it looks wrong. Or you hear a quote from a movie you love, and it is not said the way you remember. You pause for a second, maybe laugh it off, and think your brain is just being weird. It feels harmless, forgettable. But then someone else mentions the same thing. They remember it the same way you do, and suddenly that small, ordinary glitch does not feel so ordinary anymore. It feels like reality itself quietly cleared its throat, just enough for you to notice. Most of us respond to moments like that in the same way. We shrug. We blame stress. We assume we are tired, distracted, or mixing things up with something similar. And honestly, that reaction makes sense. Our brains are busy machines, constantly filling in gaps, smoothing over rough edges, and making educated guesses so we can move through life without stopping every 5 seconds to question everything. Memory, after all, is not a recording. It is more like a reconstruction. So when something does not line up perfectly, we tell ourselves it is just a mental hiccup. But what makes these moments strange is how often they happen to people in the same exact way. Not just once, not just to one person, to millions, independently, confidently, with the same details. That is when the easy explanation starts to feel a little thin. This brings us to something often described as a reality glitch, known as the Mandela effect. The name sounds dramatic, but the experience itself is surprisingly quiet. It happens when a large group of people remember something clearly and confidently, yet that memory does not match the official record. Not sort of different, completely different. People are not guessing. They remember. They remember where they were, how old they were, how it made them feel, and when they check, reality calmly tells them they are wrong. It is not a hallucination. It is not a dream. It is a shared memory that seems to have no place to belong. What makes the Mandela effect so unsettling is not just that memory can be flawed. We already know that. It is the scale and consistency of it. These are not random errors. They are specific. Many people remember the same spelling, the same scene, the same phrase. They remember it without hesitation, and these memories are often tied to everyday things. Logos on clothes, lines from children's stories, historical events taught in school, things we assume are stable, things we build our sense of familiarity on. When those shift, even slightly, it creates a subtle feeling of groundlessness, like the floor did not collapse, but it did move. The effect appears in the most ordinary corners of life. You might be folding laundry, humming a song you have known since childhood, and suddenly realize a lyric is different. Or you might see a brand name you have read hundreds of times and feel an unexpected jolt of confusion. These moments do not announce themselves as important. They slip in quietly. But once you notice them, they tend to linger. They make you wonder how many things you take for granted simply because they feel familiar, and what familiarity is really built on. The phenomenon gets its name from a widely reported case involving Nelson Mandela. Many people around the world distinctly remember learning that Mandela died in prison during the 1980s. They remember news coverage. They remember discussions in classrooms. They remember mourning. Except Mandela did not die in prison. He was released, became the president of South Africa, and passed away decades later. When people first discovered this mismatch, the reaction was not just surprise, it was deep confusion. How could so many people remember the same false event with such clarity? Psychologists were unsettled not because memory failed, but because it failed in unison. Scientists have studied this kind of collective misremembering, and they can explain parts of it. They talk about how memories are influenced by repetition, suggestion, and shared narratives. When people hear a version of a story enough times, the brain can adopt it as truth. Over time, that memory can feel just as real as something personally experienced. But even with these explanations, something feels incomplete. These memories often form before people ever talk to each other about them. They arise independently. And when people compare notes later, the details line up in eerie ways. What really makes the Mandela effect fascinating is how it challenges our trust in our own minds. Memory is deeply tied to identity. We use it to define who we are, where we came from, and what the world has been like. When memory becomes unreliable, even in small ways, it shakes that foundation. It raises uncomfortable questions. If we can be so sure about something that never happened, what else might we be wrong about? And how would we know? Some people take this further. They suggest that these shared memory glitches point to alternate timelines, shifting realities, or subtle changes in the fabric of the universe. Science does not support those ideas, at least not yet. But science also does not fully understand consciousness or memory. Researchers admit that memory is not stored in a single place, and it is not replayed the same way each time. It is rebuilt. And every reconstruction is an opportunity for change. That alone is strange enough to sit with for a while. What makes the Mandela effect linger is not the lack of answers, but the way it feels when you experience it yourself. It is not fear. It is not panic. It is more like quiet disorientation. A sense that the world you thought you knew has tiny seams you never noticed before. Seams that usually stay hidden, but occasionally catch the light just right. So the next time you notice something that feels slightly off, something you would normally laugh away, pause for a moment. Ask yourself why it feels so certain, why it feels shared, why it refuses to disappear. Maybe it really is just the brain doing what brains do. Or maybe it is a reminder that reality, like memory, is not as fixed as we wanted it to be. And that certainty, even about the smallest things, might be one of the strangest illusions of all. Déjà, Rêvé. Have you ever had a moment where you wake up and feel strangely unsettled, even though nothing bad has happened yet? You check your phone, you see the time, you recognize your room. Everything looks normal, but there is a lingering feeling that something you just experienced was not just a dream. It feels heavier than that, more vivid, almost like a memory. You go about your day, And then, suddenly, hours later, something happens. A conversation, a sentence, a sound, and your stomach drops, because you know with quiet certainty that you have already lived this moment before. Not in real life, in a dream. And for a brief second, reality feels slightly misaligned, like two timelines just brushed against each other. Most people shake this feeling off. They laugh it away, or tell themselves it was just coincidence, maybe stress, maybe lack of sleep, maybe the brain recycling old information and tricking itself. That reaction makes sense. We are taught from a young age that dreams are meaningless noise and that memory is unreliable. When something feels strange, the easiest explanation is that our mind is playing tricks on us, and usually that explanation works well enough to let us move on. What makes this experience unsettling is how common it actually is. Many people have felt it at least once. Some have felt it many times. But because it does not fit neatly into everyday conversation, it gets brushed aside. You do not bring it up at work or school. You do not tell your friends unless you already trust them. And even then you might downplay it. You say it quickly, half joking, just in case it sounds crazy. Yet the feeling itself does not feel crazy when it happens. It feels precise, quiet, almost intimate. This experience has a name. It is called Déjà Rêvé. The phrase comes from French, and it means already dreamed. Unlike déjà vu, which feels like you have lived a moment before, Déjà Rêvé feels like you have dreamed it before. The key difference is subtle but important. With Déjà Rêvé, the familiarity does not feel like a vague sense of repetition. It feels like recognition, as if you are remembering a specific dream that you had in the past, sometimes long ago, and that dream is now unfolding in the real world. People who experience Déjà Rêvé often describe it in similar ways. They remember fragments first, a feeling, a visual detail, a sentence someone says. Then the realization hits. This exact sequence appeared in a dream, not symbolically, not loosely, but directly. The same setting, the same words, sometimes even the same emotional tone, and what makes it more disturbing is that the dream was not memorable at the time. It only becomes clear in hindsight, when reality seems to unlock it. This phenomenon is unsettling because it blurs the line between memory and imagination. We like to believe that time flows in one direction, past to present to future. Dreams belong to the past, reality belongs to now. But Déjà Rêvé challenges that neat separation. It raises a quiet but profound question. If a dream can feel like a memory before it happens, what exactly is memory doing? This does not only happen during dramatic moments. It often shows up in ordinary life, sitting in a classroom, walking down a familiar street, hearing someone tell a story you did not know you remembered. These are not moments we would normally associate with anything mystical or extreme. That is what makes it so uncomfortable. The glitch does not announce itself with flashing lights. It slips into the mundane, where we least expect it. There are documented cases that make this phenomenon difficult to dismiss entirely. One of the most cited comes from neurological studies of patients with temporal lobe epilepsy, Some patients reported extremely intense déjà vu episodes before seizures. They described detailed dream memories that felt more real than normal recollection. In some cases, the patients insisted they were remembering events from dreams that had not yet occurred. Doctors could observe abnormal brain activity, but that alone did not explain why the content felt predictive rather than merely familiar. In other cases, people without any diagnosed neurological condition reported similar experiences. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, psychologists documented accounts of individuals who felt trapped in loops of dream memory, where waking life felt like an echo of past dreams. These were not people seeking attention or fame. They were ordinary individuals deeply disturbed by how convincing the experience felt. Modern neuroscience offers partial explanations, but they remain incomplete. One idea is that the brain mislabels the source of a memory. A thought or imagination that occurred recently is mistaken for a dream from long ago. Another theory suggests that dreams simulate many possible futures, and when one of those simulations aligns with reality, the brain experiences it as recognition. These explanations are helpful, but they do not fully capture the emotional weight of déjà rêve. They explain how it might happen, not why it feels the way it does. What makes déjà rêve particularly haunting is how personal it feels. It does not feel like a general error. It feels targeted, as if your own mind is quietly telling you that it knows something you do not. And yet, it never tells you enough to be useful. You do not gain clear knowledge of the future. You only gain the unsettling sense that the boundary between dreaming and waking is thinner than you thought. Late at night, when everything is quiet, it is hard not to wonder about this. We spend nearly a third of our lives asleep. Our dreams are rich, detailed, emotional experiences that vanish by morning. What if they are not as disconnected from reality as we assume? What if some of them are rehearsals, or echoes, or something else entirely that we do not yet have the language to describe? Déjà rêve does not prove that reality is scripted or that time is broken, but it gently nudges us to question how confident we are in our understanding of consciousness. If the mind can generate experiences that feel indistinguishable from memory before they happen, then perhaps our sense of certainty is more fragile than we like to admit. The next time you have a dream that feels unusually vivid, you might brush it off as nothing, and most of the time you would be right. But if one day that dream quietly steps into your waking life, even for a moment, you may find yourself pausing, listening more carefully, wondering whether reality is as straightforward as it seems, or whether, just beneath the surface, there are small glitches quietly reminding us that we do not fully understand the system we are living in. Moberly Jourdain incident. Have you ever had one of those moments where something feels just slightly off, but not enough to panic? Maybe you walk into a familiar room, and for a second it feels unfamiliar, like the lighting is wrong, or the air feels heavier. Or you check the time and realize that far more minutes have passed than you expected, even though you swear you did nothing unusual. You probably laugh it off. You blame being tired. You shrug and move on. But deep down, there is often a quiet thought that lingers. What if something slipped for just a moment? What if reality did not line up exactly the way it was supposed to? Most people respond to these moments the same way. We tell ourselves that the brain is messy, memory is unreliable, stress makes time feel strange, and honestly, that makes sense. Our minds are constantly filling in gaps, smoothing over rough edges, and protecting us from information overload. So when something odd happens, dismissing it is often the healthiest response. Yet what is interesting is how common these experiences are. Almost everyone has had at least one moment where they felt out of place in time or space, even if only briefly. And almost no one stops to question what that really means. We are taught to move forward, not to linger on the strange pauses. This is where people begin to talk about something often called a reality glitch, not in the dramatic science fiction sense, but in a quieter, more unsettling way. A reality glitch is usually described as a moment when the world feels temporarily misaligned, not broken, not chaotic, just wrong in a subtle way. People report feeling like they stepped into the past or the future, or into a version of the world that does not quite belong to them. The key detail is that it feels real while it is happening, not like a dream, not like imagination. It feels grounded, physical, and convincing, which is exactly why it is so difficult to ignore once you really think about it. What makes these experiences fascinating is how ordinary they often are. They do not require extreme conditions or special equipment. They can happen during a walk, a conversation, or a casual trip to a familiar place. That closeness is what makes them disturbing. If reality can slip during something as simple as an afternoon stroll, then it challenges our assumptions about how stable the world really is. We like to believe time moves in one direction, memories stay in the past, and locations remain anchored. But what if those rules are more flexible than we think? One of the most famous and debated examples of this comes from an incident that occurred in the early 1900s and is still discussed today. It is known as the Moberly-Jourdain incident. In 1901, two educated and respected women named Charlotte Anne Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain visited the grounds of Palace of Versailles in France. What began as a normal sightseeing trip slowly turned into something deeply unsettling. As they walked through the gardens, both women reported feeling an abrupt change in the atmosphere. The light seemed flat and unnatural. The air felt heavy and still. Sounds appeared muted, as if the world had been wrapped in cloth. They encountered people dressed in old-fashioned clothing that did not match the era. One figure in particular stood out, a woman sketching near a building, wearing clothes that seemed to belong to the late 18th century. The women felt uneasy, disoriented, and watched, though no one appeared openly hostile. Eventually, the strange sensation faded, and the gardens returned to normal. Tourists reappeared. The lighting shifted back. The discomfort lifted. At the time, they were confused but unsure how to interpret what had happened. It was only later, after comparing notes and researching historical layouts of the gardens, that they became alarmed. They realized that some of the buildings and pathways they had seen no longer existed in the present, but did exist in historical records from the time of Marie Antoinette. Years later, they published their account, insisting that what they experienced was not a hallucination or fantasy. Both women were trained academics, familiar with careful observation and self-critique. They acknowledged alternative explanations, but maintained that something genuinely strange had occurred. Critics suggested shared delusion, suggestibility, or memory reconstruction. Supporters pointed out the detailed consistencies in their independent recollections. What unsettled researchers was not just the story itself, but the credibility of the witnesses. These were not thrill-seekers or mystics. They were rational, cautious, and fully aware of how unbelievable their account sounded. Yet they stood by it. Even today, there is no explanation that fully satisfies everyone. Psychological theories explain some aspects, but not all. Historical coincidences account for certain details, but leave others unresolved. The incident raises uncomfortable questions. Can memory and perception align in such a way that two people experience the same vivid illusion? Or is it possible that time is not as rigid as we assume? Perhaps certain places hold echoes. Or perhaps the human mind can briefly tune into patterns we do not yet understand. None of these ideas have clear answers, and that uncertainty is what keeps the story alive. What makes this especially eerie is how close it feels to everyday life. You do not need a palace or a historical landmark to experience something similar. People report feeling out of time in grocery stores, hallways, childhood neighborhoods, or empty roads. The locations are ordinary. The feeling is not, and once it happens, it tends to linger in the mind, quietly reshaping how you think about reality. So the next time you lose track of time, or feel like a place you know well suddenly feels unfamiliar, maybe pause before brushing it off completely. It might be nothing more than a tired brain. Or it might be one of those rare moments where reality briefly slips, just enough to remind you that the world may be stranger and more flexible than it appears. And if that is true, the real question is not whether these glitches exist, but how often they happen without us noticing at all. Missing time. You know that feeling when you arrive somewhere, and you honestly do not remember the last few minutes of getting there. You parked the car, turned off the engine, and suddenly you're already holding your keys, standing still, wondering how you even made it. At first, it feels harmless, almost funny. You laugh it off and say something like, "I was just on autopilot." Everyone has done that before. Your mind drifted. Time slipped a little. Nothing strange about that. But now imagine this. You leave your house to drive to a nearby store that normally takes 10 minutes. You follow the same road you always do, the same traffic lights, the same turns. When you finally arrive, you look at the clock and realize that 2 hours have passed. Not 10 minutes, not 20. 2 full hours. Your phone shows no calls, no messages. The fuel in your car is lower than it should be. And when you try to remember what happened during that missing time, there is nothing there. Not darkness, not confusion. Just blank space. Like a page torn cleanly out of your life. Most people who experience something like this do exactly what we are taught to do. They explain it away. I must have been tired. I was stressed. I zoned out. Maybe the clock was wrong. Maybe I remembered the time incorrectly. And honestly, that reaction makes sense. Our brains are good at protecting us from uncomfortable ideas. If something does not fit neatly into how we understand the world, the easiest option is to ignore it, to smooth it over, to move on. What makes this more unsettling is how often these stories appear. Not just online, not just in spooky forums, but from ordinary people. Teachers, truck drivers, office workers, parents, people with no history of hallucinations or strange beliefs. They tell similar stories in different places, different decades, different cultures. They are not looking for attention. In many cases, they are embarrassed to even talk about it. They worry they will sound foolish or unstable, so they stay quiet, carrying this strange gap in their memory alone. This is where the idea of missing time enters the conversation. It is one of the experiences often described as a reality glitch. Missing time is not just forgetting something small, like where you put your keys or what you ate for lunch. It is the sudden realization that hours have passed when they should not have, that a short walk, a brief drive, or a quick errand somehow swallowed a large piece of your day. And the most unsettling part is not the lost time itself. It is the total absence of memory. No dreams, no sensations, no feeling of having slept. Just nothing. People who experience missing time often describe a strange emotional aftertaste, a quiet unease, a sense that something happened, even though they cannot say what. Some feel disoriented. Others feel calm, but disturbed in a way they cannot explain. It is not like fainting or falling asleep. There is no moment of collapse, no warning. One moment you are there, the next, time has moved on without you. What makes this phenomenon so disturbing is how deeply it challenges something we take for granted. We assume time moves forward in a smooth, continuous way. We assume our memories line up with reality, even if they are imperfect. Missing time suggests that consciousness itself might not be as stable as we think, that awareness can slip, not gradually, but suddenly. And that raises uncomfortable questions. If you were not aware, were you still there? And if you were there, where were you? This is not something that only happens in extreme situations. It often appears in the most ordinary routines, driving familiar roads, walking home, doing repetitive tasks, moments where the brain relaxes, stops paying close attention, and lets habit take over. That is what makes it feel so close to home. You do not need a laboratory or a rare condition for this to happen. You just need to be human. One of the most well-known real-world contexts where missing time appears is in long-distance driving. Truck drivers, in particular, have reported arriving hundreds of kilometers beyond their last remembered location. Logbooks sometimes confirm the distance traveled, even when the driver has no memory of it. Researchers studying highway hypnosis have tried to explain this as an extreme form of automatic behavior, where the brain handles tasks without conscious awareness. But even those explanations struggle when the missing time stretches far beyond what autopilot alone should allow. There are also documented cases from psychology where people undergoing intense stress or trauma experience time gaps. The mind, overwhelmed, seems to step away. Yet many missing time reports come from calm situations with no obvious trigger, no danger, no emotional overload. Just a normal day that suddenly has a hole in it. Historically, similar stories appear long before modern psychology had names for them. In older journals and letters, people described losing hours while walking familiar paths or working in the fields. They often framed it in spiritual or supernatural language, not because they wanted mystery, but because they had no other explanation. Today we use scientific terms, but the core experience has not changed. What unsettles researchers is not that memory can fail. We know memory is fragile. What unsettles them is the precision of these gaps, the way time seems to vanish cleanly, without blur or confusion, and the way people often realize it only afterward, like waking up to find a chapter missing from a book you were reading. Science continues to explore possible explanations, brain states, dissociation, attention loops, but none fully account for every detail, especially the emotional certainty people feel that something is missing, not just forgotten, as if awareness itself stepped aside and something else took its place. So the question lingers quietly in the background. If consciousness can switch off without us noticing, what does that say about our sense of self? Are we always present in our own lives, or only most of the time? And if time can disappear without leaving a trace, how many moments have already slipped by unnoticed? Missing time does not shout. It whispers. It hides inside ordinary days and familiar roads. And once you start paying attention to it, the world feels just a little less solid. Not broken. Just stranger than it looks. Double slit experiment. Have you ever checked the time on your phone? Looked away for what felt like a few seconds, and then checked again only to realize several minutes are gone. Not scrolling, not daydreaming in any obvious way. Just gone. Maybe you laughed it off. Maybe you blamed your attention span. Or maybe for a brief moment you felt something colder, like time itself skipped. Another version of this happens when you swear you placed your keys on the table. You can picture them there clearly, yet they are nowhere to be found until they suddenly reappear later in the exact spot you already checked. These moments are usually treated like jokes, little brain hiccups, nothing worth worrying about. But if you sit with that feeling for just a second longer, it becomes harder to ignore the quiet question underneath. What if something actually changed when you were not looking? Most people react to these moments in the same way. We shrug. We blame stress, lack of sleep, distraction, or imagination. We tell ourselves the brain is messy and memory is unreliable, and honestly, that makes sense. Life is busy. Our minds are overloaded. Of course we miss things. Of course we misremember. And yet, what is interesting is how universal these experiences are. Almost everyone has felt them at some point. That strange sense that reality did not behave the way it was supposed to. And almost no one stops to examine why they feel so unsettling. We dismiss them not because they are meaningless, but because the alternative feels uncomfortable. Questioning reality, even gently, can feel like pulling on a loose thread you are not sure you want to unravel. This is where the idea of a reality glitch begins. Not as a dramatic break in the universe, but as something much quieter. A moment where the world seems to hesitate. A moment where observation itself feels important. A reality glitch is not about monsters or simulations or sudden miracles. It is about the unsettling possibility that things do not exist in a fixed way where no one is paying attention. It is the feeling that reality might be more like a performance than a solid object. Most people who describe these glitches say the same thing. It feels small, subtle, easy to dismiss, and yet it lingers in the back of the mind, refusing to fully go away. Few ideas capture this unease better than the double-slit experiment. On the surface, it sounds like a simple physics demonstration, but once you understand what actually happens, it stops feeling like science and starts feeling like a quiet violation of common sense. Imagine firing tiny particles at a wall with two narrow openings. Behind the wall is a screen that records where the particles land. You would expect each particle to pass through one opening or the other, leaving two clear clusters on the screen. That is what everyday logic predicts. Objects go through one place at a time. But that is not what happens. Instead, the pattern that appears looks like waves overlapping each other, as if each particle somehow went through both openings at once. Not metaphorically, literally. The universe behaves as if the particle is everywhere until something forces it to choose. And here is the part that makes people uncomfortable. When scientists place a detector to observe which opening the particle goes through, the wave pattern disappears. Suddenly, the particle behaves like a normal object again. It chooses one path. The act of watching changes what happens. This is not a trick. It is not a mistake. It has been repeated countless times. When no one watches, reality behaves one way. When someone watches, it behaves another. This is where the experiment stops being just about particles and starts touching something much closer to home. Because it raises a question we almost never ask. What role does observation play in the world we experience every day? Think about how often your life runs on autopilot, walking familiar streets, reaching for objects without thinking, letting hours pass unnoticed. Now imagine that attention itself is not just a mental state, but an active ingredient in reality. The double-slit experiment suggests that something about awareness forces the universe to make up its mind. Until then, possibilities remain open, overlapping, unresolved. This idea deeply disturbed many scientists, not because it was mystical, but because it refused to fit neatly into our usual picture of how the world works. Reality is supposed to exist independently of us. A chair does not need to be watched to remain a chair. And yet, at the smallest levels we can measure, that assumption starts to wobble. The experiment does not say consciousness creates reality. It also does not say it does not. It simply shows that observation matters in a way we still do not fully understand. Over time, variations of this experiment made the mystery even stranger. In some versions, the choice to observe is delayed until after the particle has already passed through the openings. And somehow, the outcome still changes. as if the present decision reaches backward, rewriting what already happened. Scientists can describe the results mathematically, but explaining what is actually going on remains deeply unsettling. It feels less like watching a machine and more like interacting with something that responds to being noticed. This is why the double slit experiment often appears in conversations about reality glitches. Not because it proves reality is fake, but because it shows that reality is not as passive as we assume. It reacts, it adapts, it waits. And that should make us pause, because in everyday life we are constantly observing without realizing it, paying attention, ignoring things, looking away, looking back. Maybe those moments when time slips or objects seem to move are not failures of memory at all. Maybe they are reminders that the world is not frozen in place when we stop looking, that it exists in a softer state, full of potential, until attention sharpens it into something definite. The double slit. Experiment does not tell us what reality is. It tells us what reality does when we interact with it. And the more we listen, the more it feels like reality is less of a solid structure and more of a conversation, one we are part of, whether we realize it or not. So the next time something feels slightly off, when a moment disappears, when something seems to change only after you notice it, instead of laughing it away immediately, try sitting with the discomfort for a second longer. Ask yourself a quiet question before sleep. How much of the world is already decided, and how much of it is still waiting for you to look? Quantum entanglement. Have you ever thought about someone you have not spoken to in years? Someone who has completely faded into the background of your life, and then your phone lights up with their name. Or maybe you suddenly remember a moment from your childhood, a tiny detail you have not thought about in decades, and later that same day, someone else mentions it out loud. Most of the time, we laugh it off. We say things like, "Wow, what a coincidence," or "that is creepy timing." Then we move on. But for a brief second, there is that quiet pause, that feeling that something lined up a little too perfectly, like reality blinked, like something behind the scenes nudged two distant moments together just to get your attention. Most people react to experiences like this in a very reasonable way. We blame stress, we blame pattern-seeking brains, we blame imagination or selective memory. After all, we think about thousands of things every day, and only notice the rare times something lines up. That explanation makes sense. It is comforting. It allows us to stay grounded and avoid spiraling into unnecessary questions. But here is the strange part. Almost everyone has stories like this. Too many stories. Across cultures, ages, and backgrounds, people report moments where two things seem connected without any obvious reason. And while we are quick to dismiss them, we also cannot help feeling that small chill when they happen. That sense that something deeper might be going on, even if we do not have the words for it. This is where we begin to step into one of the most unsettling ideas in modern science, something often described as a reality glitch, something that sounds like it belongs in science fiction, but keeps showing up in real experiments. It is called quantum entanglement. At first, the name itself feels distant and technical, but the idea behind it is surprisingly simple and deeply strange. Imagine two things that become connected in such a way that what happens to one instantly affects the other, no matter how far apart they are. Not later. Not after a signal travels. Instantly. As if distance no longer matters. To understand why this is so disturbing, it helps to think about how we usually experience the world. If you drop a glass, it shatters where it lands. If you flip a light switch, the light turns on, because electricity flows through wires. Everything seems local. Cause and effect appear connected by space and time. Something happens here, then something happens there. But quantum entanglement does not follow that rule. When two particles become entangled, they act like a single system, even when separated by vast distances. Change one, and the other responds immediately, as if reality itself forgot to include space in the equation. What makes this even more unsettling is that this is not just a theoretical idea. It is something scientists have tested again and again. In carefully controlled experiments, researchers create pairs of particles that share a linked state. When they measure one particle, the other behaves in a way that matches that measurement, even if it is far away. And the strange part is not just that they are correlated. The strange part is that the connection seems to exist before any measurement happens, as if the particles somehow know about each other in advance. This challenges some of our most basic assumptions. We like to believe that objects have their own independent properties, that things exist with clear boundaries, that information cannot travel faster than light. Quantum entanglement quietly undermines all of that. It suggests that at a fundamental level, reality may be less like a collection of separate things and more like a web, a system where parts cannot be fully described on their own, only in relation to something else. What makes this idea feel uncomfortably close to home is how it echoes experiences in everyday life. Think about emotional connections. The way you can sense something is wrong with someone you care about before they tell you. The way certain people seem to stay in your thoughts at the same time you appear in theirs. We usually explain these moments psychologically, and that is fair. But knowing that nature itself allows deep connections that ignore distance makes those explanations feel a little less complete. It does not prove anything mystical, but it does leave the door slightly open. One of the most famous moments in the history of this idea happened when a group of physicists designed experiments to test whether these connections could be explained by hidden factors we just have not discovered yet. The hope was that maybe the particles carried secret instructions from the moment they were created, something that made their behavior predictable without requiring any strange instant connection. But time and time again, the results did not support that comforting idea. The particles behaved as if no such hidden instructions existed. The connection itself seemed to be the fundamental thing. Even the scientists studying this were unsettled by it. Some openly admitted that they did not like what the results implied, even though the math and experiments were clear. One famous physicist described entanglement as spooky action at a distance, not as a poetic phrase, but as an expression of genuine discomfort. The universe was doing something that did not fit neatly into human intuition. What makes quantum entanglement especially eerie is that it does not seem to care whether we understand it. It works whether we like it or not. It does not explain itself. It simply shows up, quietly breaking the rules we thought were unbreakable. And while we cannot use it to send messages or control reality in any dramatic way, its mere existence forces us to rethink what separation really means. Are two things ever truly separate? Or is separateness just something that emerges at our scale, a convenient illusion that breaks down when we look closely enough? If the building blocks of reality can remain linked across space, what does that say about the nature of connection itself? Late at night, when the world is quiet and your thoughts slow down, these questions tend to linger. That strange phone call, that shared thought, that feeling that something lined up too perfectly. Quantum entanglement does not say those moments are connected. It does not claim meaning or intention. But it does quietly remind us that reality is capable of connections far stranger than we ever expected. And maybe the real discomfort comes not from the science itself, but from what it hints at. That the universe might be less like a machine made of separate parts, and more like a single unfolding process, where distance is not always what it seems, where separation is not absolute, where something can be shared without traveling. So the next time something small and strange happens, something you usually laugh off, you might pause a little longer. Not because you have found an answer, but because you have glimpsed a question. And sometimes the questions are the real glitches. Taos hum. Have you ever been lying in bed late at night, the lights off, everything finally quiet, and you notice a faint sound in the distance, not loud, not sharp, just a low, steady hum. At first you assume it is nothing, maybe an appliance, maybe traffic far away, maybe your ears ringing after a long day. You shift your position, pull the blanket tighter, and try to ignore it. But the sound does not go away. In fact, the quieter the room becomes, the more noticeable it feels. And at some point, a strange thought creeps in. What if this sound is not coming from inside your house at all? What if it is coming from somewhere much larger, something you cannot see or easily explain? Most of us laugh moments like this off. We tell ourselves we are tired, stressed, overthinking. The brain does weird things when it is late and dark. Maybe it is just imagination filling in the silence. That reaction makes sense. Our minds are very good at finding simple explanations, especially when the alternative feels unsettling. And most of the time, that works. We move on, fall asleep, and forget about it by morning. But what makes this reaction incomplete is how often people report the same experience, using almost the same words, even when they live far apart and have never spoken to each other. A low hum, a distant vibration, a sound you feel more than hear. Something ordinary enough to ignore, yet strange enough to linger in the back of your mind. This brings us to something often described as a reality glitch, a phenomenon that feels like a small crack in the normal rules of everyday life. It is known as the Taos hum. People who experience it describe a persistent, low-frequency sound that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It is not constant for everyone, but when it appears, it can last for hours, days, or even years. Some hear it mostly at night. Some hear it indoors. Others notice it more in quiet, rural areas. What makes it strange is that many people standing right next to each other will have completely different experiences. One person hears it clearly, another hears nothing at all. What does it feel like? Imagine standing near a large engine that is running far away, beyond the horizon. You cannot see it. You cannot point to it. But you feel its presence as a pressure in the air. Some people say it feels like a distant truck idling forever. Others describe it as a deep drone, similar to wind trapped inside a tunnel. For a few, it is not just a sound, but a physical sensation, like vibration in the chest or ears. It stands out because it does not behave like normal noise. You cannot always record it. You cannot always locate it. And turning off electronics does not make it stop. This is where it becomes disturbing. We like to believe that if something is real, it should be measurable and consistent. A sound should have a source, a cause, a clear explanation. The Taos hum challenges that assumption. It shows up in ordinary lives, in bedrooms, in kitchens, in small towns where nothing unusual seems to be happening. People go to work, pay bills, cook dinner, and somewhere in the background of that normal routine, this quiet mystery hums along, unnoticed by most, but deeply intrusive to a few. One of the most well-known cases occurred in the early 1990s in Taos, New Mexico. Residents began reporting a low humming sound that seemed to plague them, especially at night. What made this case famous was how seriously it was investigated. Scientists, engineers, and researchers were brought in. Surveys were conducted. Audio equipment was used. People were interviewed in detail. Around 2% of the population reported hearing the hum consistently. That might sound small, but in a town of thousands, it was enough to raise concern. These were not people looking for attention. Many were frustrated, exhausted, and even distressed by the experience. What unsettled researchers was that no clear external source could be identified. Industrial equipment was ruled out, power lines were examined, seismic activity was considered, even military activity was investigated. Some studies suggested that the hum might be related to low-frequency sound interacting with human hearing in unusual ways. Others proposed that it could be linked to subtle vibrations from the earth itself. But none of these explanations fully accounted for why only certain people could hear it, or why it felt so localized and personal. Similar hums have been reported in other places around the world, in parts of Canada, in the United Kingdom, in Australia. Different locations, same descriptions, the same quiet, intrusive presence. In some cases, the hum seems to disappear as suddenly as it arrived. In others, it lingers for years. And again, most people living in these areas hear nothing at all. This is where the idea of a reality glitch begins to feel uncomfortably plausible. Not because it proves anything supernatural, but because it exposes how limited our shared experience of reality can be. We assume that what we perceive is roughly the same as what everyone else perceives. The Taos hum suggests that reality might be layered, with certain sensations accessible only to some, under specific conditions we do not yet understand. It raises questions about perception, awareness, and how much of the world we filter out without realizing it. What if reality is not a single, uniform broadcast, but something more like a radio spectrum? Most of us tuned to the same station. A few accidentally catching a signal others cannot hear. And what if those signals are always there, quietly passing through us, unnoticed most of the time? Science continues to search for answers, and that is important. Rational explanations matter. But even now, there is no single explanation that neatly ties every case together, and that uncertainty is what keeps the Taos hum unsettling. Not because it is loud or dramatic, but because it is subtle, ordinary, easy to dismiss, until it happens to you. So the next time you find yourself in a quiet room, late at night, and you notice a faint sound that does not seem to belong anywhere, consider this. Maybe it is just your imagination. Maybe it is stress. Or maybe it is a reminder that reality has edges we rarely look at closely. And sometimes those edges hum softly, waiting to be noticed. Blindsight. Have you ever reached for something without really looking at it, only to realize your hand landed exactly where it needed to be? Maybe you were walking through a dark room late at night, half asleep, and somehow you avoided the chair, the table, the door frame, as if your body already knew where everything was. Or maybe you glanced away from the road for just a second, then snapped back and corrected the steering wheel without consciously thinking about it. Most of us laugh these moments off. We say muscle memory. We say instinct. We say autopilot. But there is a quieter question hiding underneath that moment. How did you know what to do when you did not feel like you were seeing anything at all? Most people react to experiences like that by brushing them aside. We blame habit, stress, or coincidence. It feels safer that way. After all, life is busy, and the brain does a lot of things in the background. We are told that not everything needs an explanation, and that reaction makes sense. If we stopped to question every strange mental shortcut or near miss, we would never get anything done. But what if these moments are not just mental noise? What if they are hints of something deeper happening just below awareness? Something that works silently, efficiently, and without asking for permission. Something that sees without us knowing it sees. This is where we begin to enter the territory of what people sometimes call reality glitches. Experiences that feel small and ordinary at first, but become unsettling once you look at them too closely. One of the strangest of these is something known as blindsight. At first, the word sounds like a contradiction. Seeing without seeing. It sounds impossible, and yet it is very real. Blindsight refers to a condition where a person insists they are completely blind in part of their visual field. They will tell you with full confidence that they see nothing there. No shapes, no light, no movement. Just darkness. But then something strange happens. When researchers ask them to guess what is happening in that blind area, they guess correctly far more often than chance would allow. They can point to where an object is. They can tell if something is moving or still. They can even sense emotional expressions on faces, all while sincerely believing they are just guessing. Imagine what that feels like from the inside. You are told to point toward a light you swear you cannot see. You feel silly. You shrug and point randomly. And then the researcher tells you that you were right, again and again. At some point, the joke stops being funny. Something inside you knows things that you do not consciously know, and that is where the discomfort begins. What makes blindsight so disturbing is not just that it exists, but what it implies. We like to think that vision is something we experience directly. Light hits the eyes, the brain processes it, and we see the world. Simple. Blindsight suggests that seeing and experiencing seeing are not the same thing, that your brain can gather information about the world and act on it without ever letting you in on the process. This is not just a rare medical curiosity that only affects a handful of people with brain injuries. It hints at a broader truth about all of us. Even in everyday life, we constantly respond to things we do not consciously notice. A shadow that makes us flinch, a sound that puts us on edge without us knowing why. A feeling that someone is watching us, even when we cannot explain it. Blindsight takes these vague intuitions and turns them into something measurable and undeniable. One of the most famous cases involved patients who had damage to the part of the brain traditionally associated with vision. According to everything we thought we knew, these people should have been functionally blind in certain areas, and consciously they were. They reported total darkness. But when scientists tested them carefully, a pattern emerged. These patients could avoid obstacles placed in their blind field. They could navigate hallways without bumping into things. They could even reach out and grab objects with surprising accuracy. What unsettled researchers was not just that this worked, but that the patients themselves were genuinely unaware of how they were doing it. There was no trick, no hidden awareness, no gradual realization. Even when shown the results, many patients still insisted they were only guessing. It was as if their brains were running a second visual system in the background, quietly guiding behavior while keeping consciousness completely in the dark. This challenges a comforting assumption most of us carry without realizing it. The idea that consciousness is in charge, that we see the world as it is, make decisions based on that information, and act accordingly. Blindsight suggests a different story, one where consciousness might be more like a narrator than a commander, a voice that explains events after they have already been set in motion. Once you notice this, it becomes hard to unsee it in daily life. Think about how often you react before you think, how your body pulls back from danger faster than your mind can name it, how you sometimes know the answer to a question before you know how you know it. Blindsight is just an extreme version of something that might be happening quietly in all of us. The truly eerie part is that this hidden processing feels reliable. In some experiments, people with blindsight performed better when they trusted their guesses than when they tried to reason consciously. The less they thought about it, the more accurate they were. It is as if awareness gets in the way. So what does that say about reality as we experience it? Are we actually seeing the world, or just the version our conscious mind is allowed to see? How much of reality is being filtered out? Not because it is unimportant, but because it does not fit neatly into the story of a unified self in control. Blindsight does not give us clear answers. It leaves us with questions that linger long after the experiment ends. If the brain can see without awareness, what else can it do without telling us? How many decisions feel like free choice but are quietly guided by systems we never notice? And perhaps most unsettling of all, if consciousness is not necessary for perception, what exactly is it for? Late at night, when the world is quiet and your thoughts slow down, these questions tend to feel heavier. The idea that reality might be richer and stranger than what we consciously experience is both humbling and unsettling. Blindsight reminds us that the mind is not a single spotlight, but a layered structure, full of hidden corridors doing important work in silence. And the next time you move through a dark room without bumping into anything, or sense something before you can explain it, you might pause for just a moment. Not to panic, not to find answers, but to wonder. How much of your reality is being seen by parts of you that never speak? And how much of what you call consciousness is just the surface of something far deeper, watching quietly from the dark? Alien hand syndrome. Have you ever reached for your phone without thinking, only to realize you do not remember deciding to pick it up in the first place? One moment your hands are resting quietly, and the next your thumb is already scrolling, as if it acted before you even noticed. Most of us laugh this off. We say it is habit, muscle memory, or just being tired. But pause for a second and really sit with that feeling. Your hand moved. You watched it move. And for a brief moment, it did not feel like the movement belonged to you. That tiny gap between intention and action is usually harmless, even funny. Yet it hints at something quietly unsettling. What if that gap grew wider? What if your hand did not just act before you noticed, but acted against your wishes entirely? Most people respond to moments like this in the same way. We blame stress, we blame distraction. We say our brain glitched for a second and move on. That reaction makes sense. Life is busy, our minds are overloaded, and strange sensations are easier to dismiss than to examine. Everyone zones out. Everyone feels disconnected sometimes. When your body does something automatically, it feels efficient, not threatening. And because these moments are so common, we rarely stop to question what they might say about how much control we truly have. The idea that your own body could act without you is uncomfortable, so the mind quickly smooths it over and reassures itself that everything is fine. But in the world of strange neurological experiences, there is a condition where that uneasy feeling does not fade. Instead, it becomes impossible to ignore. It is often described as a reality glitch because it breaks one of our deepest assumptions about being human. That assumption is simple: my body obeys me. Alien hand syndrome is the name given to a rare but very real condition where a person experiences one of their hands moving on its own, without conscious control, and sometimes even in direct conflict with what they are trying to do. People who experience this do not describe it as a loss of strength or coordination. The hand works perfectly. It can grasp objects, button shirts, open doors, and perform complex actions. The disturbing part is that the person does not feel like they are the one initiating those movements. The hand feels foreign, almost like it belongs to someone else. Some people even talk to it, argue with it, or refer to it as if it has its own intentions. Imagine trying to place an object on a table while your other hand quietly takes it away. Imagine buttoning a shirt while the same hand keeps unbuttoning it. These are not metaphors. These are reported experiences. What makes this phenomenon so fascinating is how close it is to everyday life. We already live with the illusion that we are one unified self, smoothly directing thoughts and actions from a single control center. Alien hand syndrome cracks that illusion. It suggests that the sense of being in charge might be more fragile than we think. The brain is not a single voice, but a collection of systems working together, usually in harmony. When that harmony breaks, something deeply strange emerges. A part of you acts with purpose, but without permission. This challenges our ideas about free will and identity. If a hand can act independently, then where exactly does the self live? Is it in the brain, in awareness, or somewhere else entirely? The unsettling part is that the hand is not random. It does things that make sense, in context. It reaches for nearby objects. It responds to the environment. It behaves intelligently, just not obediently. That makes it harder to dismiss as simple malfunction. One of the most well-known real-world examples comes from patients who have undergone brain surgery to treat severe epilepsy. In some cases, surgeons separated the two hemispheres of the brain to prevent seizures from spreading. After surgery, a few patients began to report bizarre experiences with one hand. The hand would pick things up without permission, interfere with tasks, or even perform actions the person consciously tried to stop. One patient described trying to close a drawer with one hand while the other kept opening it. Another reported their hand reaching out to touch objects despite strong efforts to keep it still. What troubled researchers was not just the behavior, but the clarity with which patients described it. They were fully aware. They were not confused or hallucinating. They knew the hand was part of their body, yet it did not feel like it belonged to them. Some patients said it felt like watching someone else use their arm. Scientists could observe the movements and confirm that they were real and purposeful. Yet there was no simple explanation that satisfied everyone. Even today, modern neuroscience can describe which brain regions are involved, but it struggles to explain the experience itself. Why does the loss of communication between brain systems create the feeling of an alien presence? Why does awareness stay with one intention while action follows another? Science can map activity, but it cannot fully explain why consciousness feels unified when it is, and fragmented when it is not. What makes alien hand syndrome especially eerie is that it does not feel like a movie monster or science fiction idea. It feels like a quiet betrayal from within. There is no pain, no dramatic transformation, just a subtle but profound loss of ownership. And when you think about it, smaller echoes of this exist in everyday life. Habits you try to break but cannot. Actions you perform automatically, even when you know better. Words that slip out before you can stop them. These are not the same thing, but they rhyme with the same question. Who is really in control? As you listen to this, your hands are probably resting somewhere nearby. They feel like yours. They move when you want them to. But that confidence depends on invisible cooperation happening inside your brain every second. Alien hand syndrome reminds us that this cooperation is not guaranteed. It works most of the time, and when it does, we never notice it at all. So the next time your hand moves before you think, or you catch yourself acting on autopilot, pause for a moment. Not in fear, but in curiosity. Ask yourself where intention truly comes from, and how thin the line is between choosing an action and watching it happen. If a part of you can act without you, even briefly, then what does that say about the nature of the self? And if reality feels stable only because these systems usually agree, what happens when they do not? Perhaps the strangest glitches are not in the world around us, but in the quiet assumptions we make about who we are. Phantom limbs. Have you ever reached for your phone in your pocket, felt it vibrating, and then pulled it out, only to realize it was not there at all? No notification, no missed call, just silence. Most people laugh it off, a phantom buzz, your brain playing tricks on you. But in that brief moment before you checked, it felt real. Your body reacted before your mind had time to question it. Now imagine that same certainty, that same physical conviction, but stretched far beyond a phone vibration. Imagine feeling something that you know should not exist anymore, feeling it clearly, repeatedly, sometimes painfully, sometimes tenderly. And no matter how often you remind yourself of the truth, your body refuses to listen. Most of us are trained to dismiss experiences like this. We blame stress, fatigue, overthinking. We tell ourselves that the brain is messy and imperfect, and that little misfires are just part of being human. That reaction makes sense. Life is already complicated enough without questioning every strange sensation or misplaced feeling. And yet, what is unsettling is how common these experiences are. How many people feel something that is not there? How many quietly wonder if their mind is lying to them, then shrug and move on? These moments are brushed aside not because they are rare, but because they are familiar. And familiarity has a way of making the strange feel harmless. This brings us to one of the most unsettling phenomena, often described as a reality glitch: phantom limbs. The name sounds simple, almost clinical, but the experience itself is anything but. A phantom limb is when someone feels a body part that no longer exists, not as a vague memory or an imagined outline, but as a vivid physical presence. Fingers curling, toes itching, a hand clenching in pain. These sensations are not symbolic. They are not metaphors. To the person experiencing them, they feel just as real as any other part of their body. What makes this phenomenon so strange is not just that it happens after amputation. It is how convincing it is. People report feeling the weight of an arm resting on their chest, the warmth of a leg under a blanket. Some feel their missing hand trying to scratch an itch that cannot be reached. Others feel sharp pain, twisting or burning, as if the limb were still there and suffering. The brain behaves as though nothing has changed, even when the physical reality clearly has. This challenges something most of us take for granted, that our body is a direct reflection of physical reality, that what we feel matches what exists. Phantom limbs quietly undermined that assumption. They suggest that your sense of having a body does not come from your body alone. It comes from a map inside your mind, a model that can persist even when the physical structure it represents is gone. What makes this even more unsettling is how close this experience is to everyday life. You do not need to lose a limb to experience a version of this. Many people feel their phone vibrate when it does not. Others feel the presence of someone who is not there. Some wake up certain they are holding something, only to open their hand and find it empty. These moments hint at the same underlying mechanism, your brain predicting reality rather than simply observing it. One of the most famous figures to study phantom limbs was a neurologist named Vilayanu Ramachandran. He worked with patients who had lost arms or legs and were haunted by sensations that refused to disappear. One patient described feeling his missing arm frozen in a painfully clenched position. Another felt his absent hand being crushed. These were not rare cases. They were common. And they raised a disturbing question. If the limb is gone, where is the pain coming from? In one striking case, Ramachandran noticed something unusual. When a patient touched certain areas of his face, he felt the sensation in his missing hand. Stroking the cheek produced the feeling of fingers being touched. This suggested that the brain regions responsible for the face and the hand were somehow overlapping. The map of the body and the brain was rearranging itself, but not cleanly. The old signals were bleeding into new territory. To explore this further, Ramachandran introduced a simple but eerie tool, a mirror box. The patient placed their intact hand inside the box, positioned so that its reflection appeared where the missing hand should be. When the patient looked into the mirror, it looked like they had two hands again. When they moved the intact hand, the reflection moved too. For some patients, this illusion was enough to relieve pain. The brain, seeing the missing hand move, updated its internal model. The frozen limb seemed to relax. The pain eased. This was astonishing, not because it cured everyone, but because it revealed something profound. The brain does not need reality to be real. It needs reality to be convincing. A reflection was enough to change physical pain. An illusion could rewrite sensation. And this is where phantom limbs stop being just a medical curiosity and start feeling like a reality glitch. If the brain can generate a limb that does not exist, complete with sensation and pain, what else is it generating without our awareness? How much of what we feel is a best guess rather than a direct reading of the world? How often does the mind fill in gaps without asking for permission? Phantom limbs also raise uncomfortable questions about identity. If your sense of self includes parts that are no longer there, where does the self actually live? Is it in the body, the brain, or somewhere in between? Some people report that their phantom limb feels younger than the rest of their body. Others feel it stuck in the position it was in just before it was lost. Time itself seems to freeze inside the sensation. The body moves on. The mind does not always follow. Even more unsettling is that some people born without limbs report phantom sensations too. They feel hands they never physically had. This challenges the idea that phantom limbs are just memories replaying themselves. It suggests that the brain may be born with a blueprint of the body, whether or not the body fully matches it. A template waiting to be filled. So what does this mean for the rest of us? It means that your experience of reality is not a perfect mirror. It is a construction, carefully assembled, usually reliable, but not infallible. Most of the time, the illusion works so well that we never notice it. But occasionally, it slips, and when it does, we catch a glimpse of how fragile our certainty really is. Phantom limbs remind us that feeling is not proof, that absence does not always register as absence, that the mind can insist on a version of reality long after the world has moved on. And if the brain can do this with something as fundamental as the body, what else might it be quietly inventing? As you lie there listening, feeling the weight of your own limbs, maybe notice how effortless it all feels, how natural, how unquestioned. And then ask yourself, gently, how much of that feeling comes from the world, and how much comes from the story your brain is telling you? Because once you realize that story can include things that are not there, it becomes harder to say with confidence where reality truly ends. The placebo effect. Have you ever taken a pill, maybe for a headache or a stomachache, and felt better before enough time had even passed for the medicine to work? Or maybe you drank a cup of tea that your grandmother always swore could cure anything, and somehow, against your better judgment, you actually felt relief. You probably laughed it off. You might have said something like, "It is just in my head." And maybe that was the end of it. But there is something quietly unsettling about that moment. Because if your pain faded before anything physical had time to change, then what exactly caused the relief? And if your mind can do that so easily, what else might it be doing without you noticing? Most of us react to moments like that in a very predictable way. We shrug. We blame stress. We say the body is weird. Or we tell ourselves we just wanted to feel better, so we convinced ourselves we did. That reaction makes sense. It is comforting. It keeps the world feeling stable and predictable. After all, we like to believe that causes and effects are clear. You take a real medicine, it causes a real change. Anything else feels like imagination or coincidence. And yet, almost everyone has experienced some version of this. Pain that fades because you expected it to. Symptoms that appear after reading about them. Energy that suddenly returns when someone tells you good news. These moments are incredibly common, but we rarely sit with them long enough to ask what they really mean. This is where we step into one of the strangest reality glitches that science has ever documented. It is called the placebo effect. At first, the idea sounds simple. A placebo is something that looks like a treatment, but does not contain an active ingredient. A sugar pill, a fake procedure, a harmless injection. And yet people who receive these placebos often experience real changes. Pain decreases, mood improves, symptoms disappear. Sometimes measurable changes happen in the body itself. Hormones shift, brain activity changes, immune responses adjust. The strange part is not that people feel something. The strange part is that the body responds as if something real happened, even when it did not. What makes this feel like a reality glitch is how personal and intimate it is. There is no flashing light or dramatic event. Nothing breaks or explodes. Reality does not shatter. Instead, it quietly bends. Your expectations change, and your body follows along as if expectations themselves are a physical force. People who experience the placebo effect often describe it in simple terms. They say they just started to feel better. They say the pain softened. They say their body relaxed. There is no sense of magic or drama, just a subtle shift that feels natural. And that is exactly what makes it unsettling. We grow up believing that the mind and the body are separate in clear ways. Thoughts are thoughts. Biology is biology. But the placebo effect sits right in the uncomfortable space between them. It suggests that belief is not just a passive mental state. It suggests belief can act. It can trigger changes that look, feel, and sometimes measure like physical healing. And this does not only happen in hospitals or experiments. It happens in everyday life. When you trust a brand more than another. When a doctor's confidence makes you feel calmer. When a ritual makes you feel protected. These are not rare events. They are woven into daily routines so deeply that we hardly notice them. One of the most famous and unsettling examples came from studies on pain relief. In controlled experiments, people were given identical pills. Some were told the pill was a powerful painkiller. Others were told it was inactive. In many cases, the people who believed they received pain medicine reported significant relief. Brain scans later showed reduced activity in pain-related regions. Chemicals associated with natural pain control were released. The body behaved as if it had received real medication. Scientists could block this effect by interfering with those chemicals, proving that something physical was happening, not imagined, not metaphorical, real. Even more unsettling are cases where the placebo effect worked after people were told the truth. In some modern studies, patients were openly told they were receiving a placebo. No deception, no tricks, and still many of them improved. Their symptoms lessened. Their quality of life increased. Knowing it was fake did not fully stop the effect. That raises a quiet but profound question. If belief still works when you know it should not, what exactly is doing the work? There are historical accounts that echo this strange power. Soldiers in wartime who were given saline injections when morphine ran out, and still experienced pain relief because they believed they were being treated. Patients who underwent sham surgeries and recovered just as well as those who had real procedures. Entire cultures relying on rituals and symbols that seem to produce real effects on health and resilience. Each case leaves researchers with the same uneasy feeling. We can describe what happens. We can measure parts of it, but explaining why belief can reach so deeply into the body remains frustratingly incomplete. The placebo effect also has a darker mirror called the nocebo effect. When negative expectations cause harm, people who believe a harmless substance will make them sick often experience real symptoms: headaches, nausea, fatigue, pain. Once again, the body listens. This means our expectations are not neutral. They can heal, but they can also hurt. And most of the time, this happens quietly, beneath awareness, woven into thoughts we barely notice ourselves thinking. What makes this phenomenon so disturbing is how close it is to us at all times. You do not need a laboratory. You do not need a white coat or a clipboard. Every belief about your body, your health, your limits, and your future may be shaping physical reality in small ways, not in a mystical sense, but in a deeply human one. The mind does not just observe the body, it participates in it. And the line between expectation and experience becomes much thinner than we like to admit. Science continues to study the placebo effect. Researchers map brain pathways, they identify chemicals, they build models. Each discovery explains a piece, but never the whole picture. There is always something left over, a gap where explanation fades into mystery. Why does belief work better in some people than others? Why does it work for some conditions but not others? Why does the body respond as if it trusts a story we tell ourselves? So the next time you feel better sooner than you expected, or worse, after reading something alarming, or comforted by a ritual you know should not matter, maybe pause for a moment. Not to panic, not to overthink, just to notice. Because if belief can quietly reshape pain, chemistry, and perception, then reality might be less solid than it seems, and the mind might not just be living in reality, but quietly helping to build it. So, which of these glitches caught your attention the most, or felt uncomfortably familiar to you? Maybe you have experienced something we did not even mention. Or maybe it was so strange it felt like it was meant only for you, a quiet moment the universe never explained. Share your experiences in the comments below, and let others follow you down the rabbit hole.